Maihime, or the Dancing Girl by Ougai Mori, is constantly at the center of one of the most intense debates in the Bungou Stray community. I'd like to take some time to explore some of the ways the piece is used against the pedophilia debate, and some of the ways that I think it could be used for the opposite interpretation. But first, some quick disclaimers. I know this is an incredibly controversial and touchy topic, but I want to make it clear that this isn't a refutation of one specific theory, but quite a few that I've seen in the BSD space since entering it. I also want to say that I didn't include a summary of Maihime in this video, so while I think I explain well throughout, you'd be better off reading it before you watch, or at least reading a summary. As usual, I will refer to the character as Mori and the author as Ougai. And again, this is just a suggested interpretation. Anyone is free to think what they want. I'm here to convince, if possible, but not argue, and without further ado, here is Maihime Doesn't Prove What You Think It Does. Maihime is a semi-autobiographical account of a Japanese man's studies abroad and is often referred to as a pivotal piece in the canon of Meiji ideals. The Meiji period was a time in Japan's history when the country began to take more influence from the West. This was integrated into art, literature, and by extension, everyday life. Maihime is a piece that attempts to make sense of that transition. The main character, Ota, meets a girl, Elise, the namesake of the Bungou Stray character, and becomes so obsessed with her that he neglects his duties, ultimately having to choose between Elise and Japan. In the end, he chooses Japan. As I've discussed in my previous analyses, I believe every work referenced in Bungo has been integrated into its related characters. Maihime, in my opinion, is the main informant of Mori's pattern of taking advantage of vulnerable children and disregarding their needs over his own. For reasons I will discuss, I believe the story further proves the existence of Mori's pedophilia rather than refuting it. First, I'd like to talk about the actual pedophilia that takes place within the story. Ota is 25, something that is often misconstrued. The reason for this could partially be a misreading, but is mostly based on a common idea that the novel is largely autobiographical of Ougai's time in Germany at the age of 19. However, this is not even the entire truth. Scholar Yoshiyuki Naka analyzed that Ota's character combines the personalities of Ougai and Suzuki Kiroku, another student on the former's travels. Regardless, the narrative makes a clear deviation here, as Ota describes. At 19, I finished my degree. I joined a government department, and then spent 3 pleasant years in Tokyo with my mother, whom I had called up from the country. Being especially high in the estimation of the head of my department, I was then given orders to travel to Europe, and to study matters connected with my particular section. With some quick math, Ota is 21 or 22 arriving in Berlin. He then recounts that some 3 years passed in this way like a dream. Finally, now, however, at the age of 25, is the confirmation of his age at the time he meets Elise, which is only 2 pages down. He writes, I noticed a young girl sobbing against the closed door of the church. She must have been about 16 or 17. This confirms that at the time of meeting her, he was aware she was a teenager. This is important for later, but regardless, Ota's feelings for Elise are clear from the beginning. Surprised by my footsteps, she turned around. Why was it that in one glance over, she pierced the defenses of my heart? I'm always a bit shocked to see this painted as a tragic love story, for mostly this reason. Even in 19th century Europe, when the story is set, this behavior would be looked at as weird. I'll get into more of that later, but for now we'll continue to discuss how the relationship progresses. He teaches Elise what he knows about writing in German, gushing about helping her with her accent and her letters. We'll get to that in a bit. Before admitting that there had grown up between us a kind of teacher-pupil relationship. Not 5 sentences later, he tells the reader that it was about this time that my feeling for her suddenly changed to one of love, and the bond between us deepened. Some may perhaps wonder and criticize my behavior, but my affection for Elise had been strong since our first meeting. Ota's power imbalance with Elise is insane, first with his age and her financial dependence on him, and then with, as he describes, a teacher-pupil relationship. He knows that the reader will find this behavior to be something to criticize, and he admits to this feeling being not at all new, and having loved her since she was 16 and he was 25. I remember first reading this and wondering why on earth Elise's mother would allow this under her own roof. This is such an important question to ask because it all comes back to Ota's financial power. He's the only thing supporting them, It's the same reason Elise was almost married off at the beginning of the story, and it's the same reason many of her ballet dancing counterparts are dragged into prostitution. Intentional or not, Ota is using the power he holds over this poor family to indulge in his obsession with Elise. Soon after, Elise is pregnant. Then came the winter of 1888. She brought up whatever she had to eat, and it was her mother who first suggested it might be morning sickness. This is confirmed a few pages later. She said she had been to the doctor, and that he had confirmed she was pregnant. To add on top of everything else, Elise is now even more dependent on this man. She will need all the support she can get, and if he leaves her, she is socially and financially devastated. Before we get to the final nail in the coffin, I want to add how vulnerable Elise is as a character, because it's one of the main aspects I want to talk about with Mori's parallel victims. Firstly, when he meets Elise, she is mentally and emotionally distraught over her impending marriage or trafficking, it isn't made clear, to the manager of her ballet theater. Distraught because she is far too young and he is far too old. All the while she sobs and tells Ota this. His narration is some of the creepiest and weirdest I've ever read. She was exceedingly attractive. In the lamplight her pallid face had a faint blush, and the slender beauty of her hands and feet seemed hardly to belong to the daughter of a poor family. She waited until the old woman had left the room and then spoke. She had a slight accent. "It was thoughtless of me to lead you here, please forgive me, but you look so very kind. You won't despise me, will you? I suppose you don't know Schomburg, the man we were relying on for my father's funeral tomorrow. He's the manager at the Victoria Theatre. I've been working for him for 2 years, so I thought he was bound to help us. But he took advantage of our misfortune and tried to force me to do what he wished. You must help. I promise to pay you back from the little I earn, even if I have to go hungry. If not, then my mother says." She burst into tears and stood there trembling. There was an irresistible appeal in her eyes as she gazed up at me. Did she know the effect her eyes had on me, or was that unintentional? I had 2 or 3 silver marks in my pocket, but that would probably not be enough. So I took off my watch and laid it on the table. "This will help you for the time being," I said. "Tell the pawnbroker's man if he calls on Ota at 3, I'll redeem it." The girl looked startled but grateful. As I put out my hand to say goodbye, she raised it to her lips and covered it with tears. Alas, what evil fate brought her to my lodgings to thank me? She looked so beautiful there, standing by the window. All he can think about while this little girl cries over being taken advantage of is taking advantage of her. I think now is a good time to talk about erotic, grotesque nonsense. This is a critical term used to describe an era of literature in Japan and was, perhaps rightfully, used to describe Maihime. This passage is a good illustration of that. It's strangely erotic, a bit grotesque in its context, and completely unrealistic nonsense. Surely a man's view of women, Ota is painted as a hero in this story. The narration is chock full of excuses and self-pitying. He could be a hero too, in theory. After all, he swooped in to save this girl from a terrible fate. The thing that's missing, though, is he just replaced her arranged marriage with his own. She loves him, of course, but would she had he not made her feel so indebted to him, and should he be taking advantage of that? I leave you with these questions while we switch gears for a moment to talk about the fate that Elise faces at her introduction. Most girls in 19th century Europe were not getting married off or trafficked at 16. Young women living in poverty essentially had only their sex at their disposal, and became either wives, prostitutes, or, and this may be surprising, dancers. Elise isn't called the dancing girl for no reason. She was a ballet dancer, which, in the 19th century, was unfortunately not far off from simply prostitution. It was a classier, if that, version of trafficking. Ota knows all of this. But the life of a dancer is precarious. As the writer Hochlander said, "They are today's slaves, tied by a poor wage and driven hard with rehearsals in the daytime and performances at night. In the theater dressing room, they can make up and dress themselves in beautiful clothes, but outside they often do not have enough clothes or food for themselves, and life is very hard for those who have to support their parents or families. It was said that, as a result, it was rare for them not to fall into the lowest of all professions. Elise had escaped this fate, partially owing to her modest nature, and partly because of her father's protection." When he references Hochlander, he is talking about the novel Clara, or Slave Life in Europe, by Friedrich Wilhelm Hochlander. This was my key to figuring out exactly what kind of dancer Elise is, since no actual specification is given, at least in the English translation. As you may have guessed, the main character, Clara, is a ballet dancer. From this, I assume Elise is as well, and this makes the most sense. 19th century ballet dancers were, in fact, treated as terribly as Ota describes. They were almost always impoverished and forced into prostitution to the wealthy male patrons of the theater. The reason for this was mainly that these girls were some of the most scandalously dressed women in public at the time, and because they were so poor, they had no choice but to let the men exploit them. I think it was incredibly intentional for Ougai to make Elise a dancer, to mirror the ways Ota more innocently takes advantage of her and to add to the character's crushing guilt. Finally, I just want to reiterate what I've been saying for quite a while. Elise is a dirt-poor woman whose father has just died. In 19th century Europe, that was essentially a death sentence. The only prospect she has at the time she meets Ota is her meager income from the theater. This, however, is clearly not enough if her mother intends to sell her to the manager. This is why she's so easily influenced by Ota. He sort of sweeps her off her feet and gives her an out she didn't know she had. By the time he makes moves on her romantically, she doesn't think it's so bad. Her reaction would certainly be different if he had done so right out of the gate, like he wanted to, but he held back and waited. To me, this is manipulative, and not at all romantic. And it only gets worse as we progress into what he does once he gets what he wants. As I said before, at the end of the story, Ota is asked to choose between Elise, representing modernity and the West, or his job, representing tradition and Japan, and chooses the latter. With all this added context, the decision somehow seems even worse, and he himself regrets it for the remainder of the narrative. With the guilt, he returns to her, eventually, and finds that she has completely lost her mind. Her eyes were fixed in a stare, and she could not recognize those around her. She cried out my name, abused me, tore her hair, and bit the coverlet. Then she suddenly seemed to remember something, and started to look for it. Everything her mother gave her she threw away, except the nappies that were on the table. These she stared at for a moment, then pressed them to her face and burst into tears. From that time on, she was never violent, but her mind was almost completely unhinged, and she became as simple-minded as a child. The doctor said there was no hope of recovery, for it was an illness called paranoia that had been brought on by sudden excessive emotion. They tried to remove her to the Waldorf asylum, but she cried out and refused to go. She would continually clasp a nappy to her breast, and bring it out to look at it, and this seemed to make her content. Instead of staying with the woman he is completely devastated, at the end Ota leaves her once again with only some money to pay for the birth of a child. This in itself was grotesque to me, not only because the reason for Elise's state is him leaving in the first place, but because the implications for leaving a 19th century pregnant woman unwed, now jobless, and with only enough money for a midwife are shocking. It's likely that Elise will either starve or be forced into prostitution. If she is unable to sustain herself for long enough to have a healthy child, she would likely have to give it up to a foundling hospital, the only way to ensure its survival. To do this, she would have to write a written petition describing her sex life to a panel of elderly men. Very rarely were such women allowed to have their children back or even see them. Ota would have known this, or at least known that Elise could not afford to support herself, let alone a baby with no job or father. However, once again, he chose his job. Again, literarily, I think all this was added purposefully to enhance the guilt and regret Ota feels, and therefore was intended to be read as a disreputable action. Now that I've gotten out all of my critiques of the behavior of the character within the story, I want to address some things I hear people say about it that I disagree with and add some clarity to my interpretation. Firstly, a prevailing interpretation I see exclusively in the community, that is, I haven't found any scholar analyses that support it, is that prior to the conflict with his job, Maihime's main focus is about Ota's self-hatred being around someone so beautiful. I just don't see this, and I think all of the guilt and negative self-talk he narrates about his romance is because he knows he's neglecting his duties, even before his co-workers raise suspicions. This adds to the modernity versus tradition conflict I discussed, hence why it's seen as a Meiji work, and keeps it consistent throughout the whole piece. I actually want to add that originally I assumed the guilt Ota was expressing had to do with the age gap, and the way he seemed to be taking advantage of the girl, but it makes more sense for Ota as a character to not really care about that. He is very intentionally quite flawed. Next, I want to address the point that Ota's decision to leave Elise both times was not his own fault because he was experiencing heavy pressure from his co-workers and boss. I agree that this was the final straw for him, but Ota is experiencing conflict over this decision long before he is called to leave. In other words, a lot of the pressure came from his own mind. It's an internal conflict, man versus self, if you will. Again, you'll find this in many scholar papers. Ota's main fight is in his head, and by the time he's asked to leave, he puts up none. I think it's unfair to entirely attribute his decision to peer pressure. He's an adult, and both responsibilities are equally important. Lastly, I want to cover my bases about my claims on the age gap. Like I said earlier, this would have been considered weird even at the time. Elise would still be considered a child bride, and she knows it, since she reacts with a mental breakdown at the idea at the beginning. The median age for marriage as a German woman was 26 for women and 29 for men at the end of the 19th century. Because she's been impregnated, Elise is forced to marry a decade before the average woman of her time. I really believe that Ota saw a girl who was likely to be victimized by an early marriage and decided to, quote, save her by taking her for himself. In a similar vein, the follow-up claim would be that their age gap is a minor detail in the story. I would really beg to differ. Ota's struggle with self-awareness is a big point in Maihime, evidenced partially by the choice to use the first-person point of view. This was rare in Japanese prose at the time, and is used in the story to further emotional and psychological exploration, as well as to show Ota's battle with self-awareness. One of the areas he struggles to be aware of is his predatory and, at times, poor treatment of Elise. The reader's awareness of this versus Ota's obliviousness is one of the main juxtapositions I think Ougai was going for. Much like Bungou Stray Mori, Ota tells himself he is doing Elise a kindness, when in reality his actions mostly serve himself. The reader sees that and sees his inappropriateness, but he does not. Now that I've gone through my interpretation of Maihime and touched on a few things I think it does to influence Mori's character, I want to get into my actual argument of him being a pedophile, and against some common ones I see. First, I'd like to just go over some facts about Elise herself and her relationship with Mori. This is my main focus. Most of what I'm going to be arguing is that his feelings for Elise are pedophilic, rather than worrying about proving pedophilia overall. Elise is described in Mori's introduction page as being a supernatural life form that can be conjured just the way Mori prefers, or, directly translated, her harsh personality is part of Mori's characterization. Mori can also control what Elise does, which the two of them make clear in chapter 46. Since Elise appears at many different ages throughout the manga and its light novels, the interpretation remains that he controls her presentation and chooses to have her appear as a about 10-year-old girl. While his behavior around her is creepy enough, paired with their relationship in Maihime that I covered, I want to add that the name of Elise as an ability is Vita Sexualis, sexual life in Latin. It could be Maihime, for which she gets her name, but it isn't. It's an erotic novel focusing on Ougai's sexual journey and encounters with sexuality as a minor and a young adult. Every BSD ability's corresponding literary work has something to do with the ability. Generous analyses of Mori and Elise never seem to be able to explain what it is in this case. Mori's pedophilia has been explicitly and implicitly referred to, but because of the frequent and often baseless mistranslation allegations, I'm going to focus on these two that I triple-checked are translated correctly. In both instances, he is referred to as a lolicon, literally ro-ri-ko-n, impossible to interpret another meaning, once by Elise and the other by Asagiri himself. Specifically, Elise is answering the question, "Who is this man to you?" by calling Mori a lolicon, meaning that this is an aspect of their relationship, not just his personality. I really don't think that this can be taken as a practical joke, considering Mori literally exhibits creepy behavior towards the girl constantly that would support the claim. No actual child would say this about her adult guardian unless she was too young to understand the meaning, and Elise is, as we know, quite intelligent. In the second image, Asagiri responds to a review of an early volume of the manga, translated to my best ability. "Thank you for reading. Stay tuned to see Lolicon Ougai in action. Sorry, Mori-sensei." Starting with Kido-sensei, there are still many literary masters whose personalities lend themselves well to characterization, so please look forward to their future appearances. Thank you for your continued support. Asagiri has clearly referred to Mori this way since the beginning, when the only published scene was his debut, in which he acted quite strange around Elise, but nothing was too obvious or explicitly stated. Because of this, I really think that Asagiri wanted the nature of their relationship to be obvious since the beginning. Okay, so I think most people who have watched this far can actually agree that the relationship between Elise and Mori appears to be pedophilic. I think that most of the contention is actually around whether or not what appears to be is the truth. Essentially, quote, Mori is lying and adjacent arguments. There are two main ideas I see around Elise concerning Maihime specifically. Because of all the themes of guilt in the novel surrounding Elise, it is often posited that she is either a manifestation of guilt or a carrier of guilt. I see these combined sometimes as well, but their follow-up arguments almost always contradict, so I'm going to address them as two separate claims. First, Elise appearing as a child is a manifestation of guilt, not desire. Elise's form functions as a burden to Mori that reminds him of the way he treated two children, Dazai and Yosuno. While I actually really think this is a cool idea, I just don't think it's consistent with Mori's ability to change the appearance and actions of Elise. He does this at will, as we see in chapter 46, not at what his subconscious wants, so this interpretation would have Mori creating a reminder for himself as penance for his abuses. I just don't see this as being in character for him because we have no other evidence that Mori self-punishes, and Elise seems to be the only thing that makes him happy, rather than dragging his mood down. As a guilt manifestation, I would be looking for Elise to be an energy-sucking force, parallel to the titular character in Beloved, which I think Asagiri would jump right on if that was the case. Unfortunately, I just don't see that for her. She gives him energy, and he is clearly delighted by her presence and her age. Arguably more popular is the notion of Elise as a carrier of guilt rather than a manifestation. In this interpretation, in addition to being a fighting ability, Elise carries Mori's guilt over his abuses, relieving him of its burden. This is used to explain the affection he shows towards her. It also explains her young presentation as being a red herring to distract people from this being her function. My response to this is simply that I think that an adult Elise could function as a guilt carrier without raising any alarm, and would be the same either way. Additionally, since Elise can't really be killed either way, her being a child doesn't grant her any sort of innocence immunity. The toughest argument to debunk for me by far was this one. Since Mori didn't make Elise a child in Beast, and he is the same person under different circumstances, there must be a reason he chose to make Elise a child in the main timeline other than his personal desire. After thinking about this for a bit, I realized that it can be countered by using its own logic, and can actually lead to a much deeper analysis than I originally expected. Mori is the same character in both universes, just under different circumstances. The only difference, really, is his job. But as a mafia boss, he can be overt with his paraphilia and have Elise be as weird as he wants. As an orphanage director, not so much. I think he chooses to keep it more under wraps in Beast because he enjoys working in the orphanage. Why is a different question. It's probably not because he has a sick desire to creep on all of the kids there, although it could be, and it's probably not an innocent desire to be a caretaker either. I mean, he is the same man. He still has the same mind and heart that did all of those horrible things in the main timeline. In my opinion, this has everything to do with Mori continuing the pattern of using vulnerable children to make himself feel good. Selfish volunteerism, saviorism, performative activism, there's a lot of words to vaguely describe what I think Mori does. This idea of helping vulnerable kids for one's own happiness is present in Maihime with Elise, and main BSD Mori with all of the kids he brought into the mafia, so I think it makes perfect sense for Beast Mori. It's on a different scale, of course, there's no criminal organizations or sexual desire involved, it's just his own self-esteem, plus praise and positive attention from the children and his community. Like Maihime's Elise, Dazai, and Yosuno, these orphans are vulnerable, they're alone. They'll give Mori all the positive attention and power over their lives that he wants. His main motivation has always been that power in every timeline. Why would it disappear? It wasn't a result of being boss, after all, it was a motivational factor. So, Mori runs an orphanage. However, if you want to get a job as an orphanage director, you can't be acting the way main timeline Mori was, nor can you have a 10-year-old ability called Vida Sexualis, so Elise is an adult. So Mori gets what he wants, and when he gets home, Elise can be a child if he wants that too. It doesn't even have to be about that though, because all he wants in every timeline is that power and adoration from someone less powerful than himself. He doesn't need Elise for that now. Interestingly, you'll notice that when Mori has a firm hold of Sokoku in 15 and Stormbringer, Elise is nowhere to be seen. I think that Elise's presentation in the Yosuno flashback supports this as well. She's older, sure, but obviously not an adult. She's a teenager at the oldest, and is submissive to Mori in a way that gives one the creeps the same way that he behaves around a 10-year-old version. If Mori's reason for making Elise a child had to do with his job as a support mafia boss, why wouldn't she be the exact same as Beast Elise before he took the job? Finally, I want to address the core of all these arguments, which is that Mori's relationship with Elise must have some deeper meaning, because almost every Bungo ability does. Again, this can just support what I've been saying all along. Elise being an object of Mori's desire, and Mori therefore being a pedophile, can be and is meaningful. It reflects the way Mori takes advantage of vulnerable young people, which is something everyone can agree on in my experience. Pedophilia has always been about power and self-gratification. There's nothing shallow about analyzing Mori as a pedophile. It actually goes deep in his motivations, as well as literary and historical analysis of the works he is based on. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. The research, writing, recording, and editing for this took me months, so if I wasn't able to convince you to consider a different interpretation, I hope you at least learned something new, because I certainly did.